It is July 7th, 2023, and the Russo-Ukrainian war rages on. In recent weeks, Ukraine has picked up the pace of its offensive, managing to finally secure some of the sites of intense clashes with Russian forces over the past 2 summer months. However, questions still remain over the pace and losses of the Ukrainian offensive. Ground has been captured, and it appears on a local level some Russian units might be on the back foot. At the same time, Ukraine has still not managed to achieve a major breakthrough. Significant offensive power remains in the Ukrainian arsenal, including a number of Leopard tanks and British-made Challenger heavy tanks that have not yet seen combat, but will it be enough to break through Russian lines and achieve a serious victory over the Russian army? All of this in today's Frontline report. We are going to focus on 4 separate areas of the front. This is going to be a more general update of events over the last week since the previous update that I posted about concerning the pace of Ukrainian offensive actions. For those of you expecting daily updates, I apologize for the reduced frequency. As previously stated, I have been busy going through a move and have had a lot to do on my regular work schedule. But before we get into the details, I would like to kindly ask that you please consider hitting both the like and subscribe buttons, actions that are totally free for you to do but are a big help for me to grow the channel. Also consider hitting that bell icon so you do not miss the next update. The fighting over recent weeks can be divided up into 4 different sectors with varying degrees of success for both the Ukrainian and Russian armies. The first area we are going to talk about is the Dnieper River crossing that is directly across from Kherson city. Ukraine had initially established a bridgehead at the site of the no longer standing Antonovsky Bridge. Hard fighting occurred here for the better part of a week, but unfortunately for the Ukrainian army, the Russian side had a logistical advantage as their front line had direct road connections, allowing for easy reinforcement and replacement of losses. The Ukrainian side supplied their bridgehead by boats for the better part of a week, but recent reports from the battlefield seem to indicate that the Russian army finally forced a Ukrainian retreat back across the river. This information is also paired up with some interesting and vague information. While the Russian army claims that the Ukrainians have retreated, they also claim that the area formerly occupied by the Ukrainians is actually in the gray zone and the Russians are unable to move in, likely due to artillery and direct fire coming from the west bank of the river, if true. This is also accompanied by the claim that Ukraine is still trying to send fresh troops in the form of sabotage groups across the river, either in the same location or in other locations up and down the river. So it doesn't seem accurate to say that all Ukrainian troops have been evacuated to the western bank, but it does appear like the large landing force and potential for a breakthrough in the area have largely disappeared. The next area we will go over is the Zaporizhzhia front, where we are going to talk about the entire line in general. Over a front spanning several hundred kilometers, the Ukrainian army has been consistently attacking the Russians in 3 primary locations. The town of Pyatkatki appears to be back in Ukrainian hands, a very hard-fought battle that has certainly led to significant loss of life for both Russia and Ukraine. The town was previously occupied by Ukraine, only to fall back into Russian hands, and then finally, at this moment, appearing to be back under Ukrainian control. South of Orekhiv in the area of Robotny, the Ukrainian army continues to launch hard attacks on Russian positions, gaining marginal, if any, ground over the last week. By all appearances, this sector appears to have some very successful defensive actions by the Russians, which are fighting from the comfort of their primary entrenched front line. Both Robotny and Pyatkatki have dozens of fallback positions behind the main line, so an immediate breakthrough in the area appears to be unlikely for Ukraine at the time being, although I have to say that anything is possible, and I am consistently wrong in my predictions. And a little bit of a side note here, This front line that you're currently seeing here hasn't been updated, so it's not exactly accurate, but for the most part, it is. The Ukrainians do appear to have a salient to the east of the Balka Uspinivska, which is a nature reserve. It's possible the Ukrainians have actually captured the nature reserve at this moment, but I'm looking for some more confirmation on that. But the town of Robotny still lies under Russian control. The third site of heavy fighting on the Zaporizhzhia front is in the area of Veloka Novosilka, where a similar situation exists to Robotny, with marginal yet inconsequential gains for the Ukrainian army. We do not have any casualty numbers for either side that I would suggest are anything close to accurate. But from the look of it, the Zaporizhzhia battle is of an attritional nature, which Ukraine is at a large statistical disadvantage. It's pretty undeniable considering overall population of both countries and industrial military production. Ukraine should be looking for an opportunity, more or less of a breakthrough, rather than some kind of grinding battle that ultimately Russia has much more equipment and manpower to commit to. In the Donbass, Ukraine is mounting one of their more successful operations at the moment, with an assault on the Russian positions both in and around the city of Bakhmut. To the south, Ukraine has managed to gain a foothold very close to the key fortified settlement of Kleshivka. Ukraine managed to launch a local pincer and capture most of the farmland to the west and southwest of town, making Kleshivka well within reach of Ukrainian assaults. Russia is dug in tight as a tick in Kleshivka, and they are currently occupying a large trench network on the hill above the western side of town. But should Ukraine dislodge Russia from this position, it would prove easier for Ukraine to defend against counterattacks and more difficult for Russia to recapture. This is probably the most dire sector of the front for Russian troops, but by and large, it is a small piece of a 1,000-kilometer front line, and prospects for Ukrainian breakthrough and deep battle doctrine in the area are still pretty slim. In Bakhmut itself, Ukraine has managed to gain a foothold in the southwestern suburbs of the city, so an argument can be made for the Second Battle of Bakhmut at this point, but these are very early developments, and the Ukrainian army still has a lot of work to do before they can seriously consider recapturing the city. If the time frame and losses of the first Battle of Bakhmut are any kind of comparison, Ukraine likely does not currently have the manpower or equipment to recapture the city, especially if other more important goals are to be achieved. And that's simply just comparing how long it took the first battle to culminate and the estimated number of losses for each side. The northern Lugansk front line is one of the sectors where the Russian army is having more success, but still, this is a long front line that can be divided into several sectors, starting with the southern leg in the triangle of forest between Torskay, Seversk, and Kreminna. Russian forces have once again been spotted in the industrial zone of Bielogorivka. This is an area that has changed hands at least a dozen times at this point, so I wouldn't consider it to be a very consequential development at this point. To the north of here, and the forests themselves, after Russia made a series of attacks over the last week, taking over advanced Ukrainian entrenched positions, Ukraine has launched an all-out counterattack across the front, but at this point there doesn't appear to be any evidence of much Ukrainian ground gained, although this is a more recent development and it is possible we have just not yet received the relevant updates. There are not many reliable or high-quality roads leading in or out of the forest, either from the east or the west. So at this point, it does appear like it's unlikely major gains will be made by either side in the area anytime soon. Further to the north, on what we can call the Kupiansk Svatova front line, the Russian army has recently launched an attack and made gains around the dual towns of Kuzumivka, which is Russian occupied, and Novoselivske, which is Ukrainian occupied. Typically, you would see the two towns being separated by just the railroad. The Ukrainians had managed to attack into Kuzumivka, or an area which probably is considered more Novoselivske. They had crossed the railroad and occupied positions on the other side. This area actually put the city of Svatova under a significant amount of threat. The Russian army has pushed the Ukrainians back to the railroad and captured ground in the forest hedgerows south of town, significantly bettering their situation in an area that threatens the Russian frontline logistical hub of Svatova. Should the Russians capture Novoselivske, it could reverse the situation and allow for more serious development of an offensive on Ukrainian-held Kupiansk. In terms of these fronts, Ukraine has or is faltering on the Dnieper, fighting a stalemate in Zaporizhzhia, making some progress in the Donbass, and is fighting a stalemate in Lugansk. We are now 7 days into July, which begs the question, at the current rate, can Ukraine return significant portions of its territory before the rainy season, which would certainly delay further offensive actions into the winter of 2023 and 2024. Ukraine does still have offensive brigades that have not yet entered the fight, including a number of Leopard tanks, Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, Strykers, which is another IFV, Swedish stealth IFVs, which the name or call sign is escaping me at the moment, and Challenger 2 tanks, which are still untested on the battlefield against the Russian army. I doubt any of this equipment will prove to be a wonder weapon or turn the tide of battle on its own, but if the Russians have a weak point in their front and present the Ukrainians with an opportunity, then some serious damage could be done in a short amount of time if this equipment is concentrated and supplied in high enough numbers. Ukraine is patiently waiting for a golden opportunity to present itself, like in the case of the Bakhmut breakthrough last fall that led to the recapture of most of the Kharkiv region, although no plan survives contact with the enemy. And for Ukraine, they can hope Russia repeats their mistakes, but they cannot wish it into existence. That is all from me today. Once again, I thank you all for joining, and until next time.